Daniel stood outside the massive iron gates of Riverside Academy, clutching a crumpled acceptance letter in his sweaty palm. The building looked more like a castle than a school, with its tall stone walls and perfectly trimmed hedges that probably cost more to maintain than most people's yearly salary. His worn backpack felt heavier than usual, probably because it contained everything he owned in this world. 15 years old, and this was his 8th foster home. He'd stopped counting after a while, but the number stuck in his head anyway. 8 different families, 8 different bedrooms, 8 different sets of rules to learn and forget. But this time was different. This time he had something that might actually change his life. A full scholarship to one of the most expensive private schools in the state. Mrs. Rodriguez, his current foster mom, had been the one who pushed him to audition. She was different from the others. She actually listened when he played piano in her living room. Didn't tell him to keep it down or complain about the noise. One day she handed him a flyer about Riverside Academy's music scholarship program. "You should try," she'd said simply. "You're good enough." Daniel hadn't believed her. Kids like him didn't get into schools like Riverside. But he'd gone to the audition anyway, mostly because Mrs. Rodriguez had driven him there herself and waited in the parking lot for 3 hours. He'd played a piece by Chopin, his fingers shaking so badly he thought he'd mess up every note. But something had happened when he started playing. The nerves disappeared. It was just him and the music, like always. 2 weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. Now here he was, about to walk through those gates into a world he'd only seen in movies. He took a deep breath and started walking. The gravel crunched under his old sneakers, the only pair he owned. Around him, expensive cars pulled up, dropping off students who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. Designer bags, perfect hair, clothes that probably cost more than his entire wardrobe combined. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter, suddenly aware of how obviously it didn't fit right. The sleeves were too short, bought from a thrift store 2 years ago when he'd been smaller. But it was all he had. The inside of the school was even more impressive. Marble floors so shiny he could see his reflection. Chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like something out of a palace. Trophy cases lined the hallways, filled with awards and photos of successful students who'd gone on to Ivy League schools and important careers. A helpful student guide showed him to his locker and handed him a schedule. His guide was friendly enough, but Daniel could see the quick once-over, the slight pause when taking in his appearance. He was used to it. That look that said, "You don't belong here." The morning classes were overwhelming. Teachers who assumed everyone had private tutors and summer enrichment programs. Classmates who casually talked about vacation homes in Europe and ski trips to Switzerland. Daniel stayed quiet, taking notes, trying to blend into the background. It was a survival skill he'd perfected over the years, but then came music class and everything changed. The music wing was in a separate building, connected by a covered walkway. The practice rooms had glass doors and windows so you could see inside each one. And the pianos. Daniel had never seen so many beautiful pianos in one place. Grands, uprights, each one probably worth more than a car. The music teacher, Mr. Harrison, was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. He welcomed the class and began talking about the semester's curriculum. Then he mentioned something that made Daniel's heart race. As many of you know, our annual Autumn Showcase competition is coming up in 6 weeks. The winner will perform at the State Concert Hall and receive a $5,000 prize. All piano students are eligible to compete. $5,000. Daniel's mind spun. That was more money than he'd ever seen in his life. Money that could change things. Maybe help pay for college applications or books, or maybe even a cheap car so he wouldn't have to rely on others for rides all the time. After class, students clustered around Mr. Harrison, asking questions about the competition. Daniel hung back, waiting until most had left. When he finally approached, Mr. Harrison smiled at him warmly. "You're our scholarship student, right?" "Daniel?" "Yes, sir. I heard your audition recording. Very impressive." "Will you be competing?" Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. "Excellent. You'll need to choose your piece within 2 weeks and register. Practice rooms are available on a sign-up basis. I look forward to hearing what you prepare." As Daniel left the music building, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But then he heard the laughter. A group of students stood near the lockers and one of them was staring right at him. The boy was tall, confident, with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to worry about anything. His friends surrounded him like a protective bubble of privilege. "That's the charity case," one of them said, not even trying to whisper. "Did you see his jacket?" "My dad donated like $500,000 to this school," the tall boy said. His name was Tyler, Daniel would learn later. Tyler Whitmore, whose family name was on half the buildings on campus. And they're letting scholarship kids compete in the showcase now? "That's hilarious." The group laughed and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there with burning cheeks. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floors and never be seen again. But instead he walked to his next class with his head down, just like he'd done in every other school, every other foster home, every other place where he didn't quite fit. That evening, back at Mrs. Rodriguez's house, Daniel sat at her old upright piano. The keys were yellowed and some of them stuck, but he didn't care. He began to play, working through a piece he'd been learning from a YouTube video. He couldn't afford lessons, so YouTube had become his teacher. Hours and hours of watching performances, slowing down videos to see finger positions, teaching himself music theory from free websites. Mrs. Rodriguez came in with a cup of hot chocolate and set it on the piano's edge. "How was the first day?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "It's a nice school." She sat down on the couch behind him, and he could feel her watching. Mrs. Rodriguez had this way of knowing when something was wrong without him having to say it. "You know," she said after a moment, "I grew up poor. Really poor. When I got my first real job, working in an office with people who'd gone to fancy colleges, I felt like an imposter every single day. Like someone would figure out I didn't belong and send me back to where I came from." Daniel's fingers paused on the keys. "But then I realized something. They might have had the fancy degrees and the right connections, but I had something they didn't. I'd had to fight for everything I had. That made me stronger, hungrier, more determined. Their easy path made them soft. My hard path made me tough." She stood up and patted his shoulder. "Don't let them make you feel small, Daniel. You earned your place at that school. They were just born into theirs. There's a big difference." After she left, Daniel sat at the piano for a long time, thinking. Then he pulled out his phone and started researching competition pieces. If he was going to compete, he needed something impressive, something that would prove he belonged. He found it an hour later. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious for his skill level. The piece was famous for being incredibly difficult, requiring both technical precision and deep emotional expression. Professional pianists spent years perfecting it, but as Daniel listened to a recording, something clicked. The music started dark and heavy, almost sad, but slowly built into something triumphant and beautiful. It felt like his own story, starting in darkness but fighting toward the light. He'd never played anything this challenging before. He'd probably fail, but Mrs. Rodriguez's words echoed in his mind. "Fight for everything you have. Don't let them make you feel small." Daniel opened his notebook and started breaking down the piece measure by measure. He had 6 weeks. 6 weeks to learn what most students would spend 6 months preparing. 6 weeks to prove that he wasn't just a charity case. 6 weeks to show Tyler Whitmore and everyone else at Riverside Academy that talent didn't come with a price tag. He placed his fingers on the worn keys of Mrs. Rodriguez's piano and began to practice the opening measures. The piano was out of tune and the action was stiff, but it didn't matter. This was just the beginning. What Daniel couldn't know yet, was that the challenge ahead would be far greater than just learning a difficult piece. Forces were already moving against him, plans being made to ensure he'd fail before he even had a chance to succeed. But that night, in the small living room of a modest foster home, a boy with nothing but determination began preparing for the fight of his life. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the years of disappointment and rejection, something unbreakable was taking root. The first 3 weeks at Riverside Academy passed in a blur of early mornings and late nights. Daniel had quickly learned that getting practice time at the school wasn't easy. The good practice rooms, the ones with the best pianos, were always booked by students who seemed to have inside information about when the schedule opened up. By the time Daniel tried to sign up, only the leftover slots remained. So he adapted. He started showing up at 5 in the morning before most students even thought about waking up. The security guard, an older man named Robert, would let him in with a knowing nod. Robert never asked questions, just handed him a visitor badge and pointed toward the music wing. Those early morning hours became sacred. Just Daniel and the piano. No one around to judge or whisper or stare. He'd work through Rachmaninoff's concerto section by section, recording himself on his phone and listening back during lunch, identifying mistakes, planning his next practice session. The piece was even harder than he'd imagined. His hands would cramp after an hour of practice, and some of the chord progressions seemed physically impossible to play smoothly. But slowly, painfully, it started to come together. The muscle memory was building. His fingers were learning the patterns. At home, Mrs. Rodriguez's piano became his evening refuge. Sure, it was old and out of tune, but it let him put in extra hours without having to compete for practice room time. Some nights he'd practice until his fingers ached, until Mrs. Rodriguez would gently remind him that neighbors might complain. School life, though, was getting harder in other ways. Tyler Whitmore had made it his personal mission to remind Daniel that he didn't belong. It started small. Comments in the hallway. "Hey, scholarship boy, your jacket's looking extra thrift store today." His friends would laugh on cue like a trained audience. Daniel ignored it. He'd dealt with bullies before. Words couldn't hurt him, not really. He'd survived much worse than some rich kid's insults. But Tyler wasn't just throwing insults. He was playing a longer game. It started with the practice rooms. Daniel would show up for his scheduled time, only to find Tyler or one of his friends already inside, claiming there must have been a scheduling mix-up. The music department secretary, a nervous woman who seemed terrified of upsetting anyone important, would apologize profusely but somehow always side with Tyler. "I'm sure it's just a computer error," she'd say, not meeting Daniel's eyes. "Why don't you take practice room 7 in the basement instead?" Then his sheet music started disappearing. Daniel would leave his folder in his locker, and the next day pages would be missing. Not all of them, just enough to be frustrating. He started carrying everything in his backpack, never leaving it unattended. In music class, Tyler would make a show of discussing his competition piece, loud enough for everyone to hear. He'd chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a famously beautiful and technically demanding work. He'd mentioned casually how his private instructor, a professor from the nearby conservatory, had been working with him on interpretation. Daniel had YouTube and determination. Tyler had a professional teacher who charged $200 an hour. The other students fell into two camps. Most ignored Daniel completely, neither friendly nor hostile, just indifferent. A few seemed sympathetic but weren't willing to risk their social standing by actually being kind. That was fine. Daniel didn't need friends. He needed practice time and a working piano. 4 weeks before the competition, Mr. Harrison made an announcement that changed everything. "Due to the piano tuner's schedule," he explained to the class, "we'll be assigning specific practice pianos to competition participants for the final month. This ensures consistency in your preparation and allows our technician to maintain the instruments you'll be working with." He read from a list. Tyler got practice room 1, the crown jewel of the music wing, with a gorgeous Steinway grand that was only 5 years old. Other students got similarly nice assignments. "Daniel," Mr. Harrison said, looking up from his list, "you'll have practice room 7, the basement room." The one they always tried to stick him with anyway. Daniel felt his stomach sink but kept his expression neutral. He'd learned not to show disappointment. It only gave people ammunition. After class, he asked Mr. Harrison about it. "Sir, is there any chance I could use a different room? Room 7's piano is pretty old and some of the keys stick." Mr. Harrison looked uncomfortable. "I understand your concern, but the assignments have been finalized. The practice rooms are allocated based on, well, various factors. Room 7 is adequate for preparation purposes. Various factors. Translation, donations to the school, family connections, status. All the things Daniel didn't have. However," Mr. Harrison added, seeing Daniel's face, "I'll make a note for the technician to check on that piano when he comes next week. We want all our students to have proper instruments." It wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel thanked him and headed to practice room 7 to see what he was working with. The basement practice rooms were nothing like the ones upstairs. No windows, no natural light, just fluorescent bulbs that hummed constantly. The walls were concrete block painted a depressing beige. Practice room 7 was at the very end of the hallway, the furthest from everything. Daniel opened the door and flipped on the light. The piano inside was definitely old, probably 30 or 40 years, with scratches on its wooden case and keys that had yellowed with age. He sat down and played a few scales. The action was heavier than the newer pianos upstairs, and yeah, a couple of keys did stick slightly, but it worked. He could make it work. For the next week, Daniel threw himself into practice with renewed intensity. He had to work harder, push further. If Tyler had every advantage, Daniel would compensate with sheer determination. 5 in the morning until 7, then classes, then back to room 7 from 4 until 6, then home to Mrs. Rodriguez's piano until his fingers couldn't take any more. The Rachmaninoff was starting to sound like music instead of just notes. The emotional core of the piece was beginning to emerge. When he played the sweeping melodies, he thought about all the times he'd moved between foster homes carrying everything he owned in a garbage bag. When he played the powerful, triumphant sections, he imagined a different future, one where people couldn't dismiss him because of where he came from. But something strange happened. 3 days before the scheduled piano tuning, Daniel arrived at practice room 7 for his usual afternoon session and immediately knew something was wrong. The maintenance door at the end of the hallway was propped open, and he could hear voices inside. He glanced through the door as he passed and saw something that made him pause. 2 maintenance workers were carefully moving a piano on a wheeled dolly. But they were taking it out of the storage area, not putting it in. And behind them he could see another piano, one that looked even older and more beaten up than the one currently in room 7. One of the workers noticed him staring. "Help you with something?" "No, sorry, just heading to practice." The worker shrugged and went back to maneuvering the piano. Daniel continued to room 7, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. He was probably just being paranoid. They were probably just moving things around for the tuning appointment. He practiced for 2 hours, working on the most technically challenging section of the concerto. By the time he finished, his hands were tired but satisfied. The piece was coming together. He could actually imagine performing it now, could visualize himself on that stage. As he packed up his music, Tyler appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, smirking. "Still practicing down here in the dungeon?" "That's dedication." Daniel didn't respond. He'd learned that engaging with Tyler only encouraged him. "You know," Tyler continued, "my dad was just talking to the headmaster yesterday. They were discussing how important it is to maintain traditions at Riverside. Keep the school's reputation strong." Daniel zipped his backpack, still not looking up. "The thing is," Tyler went on, "competitions like the showcase, they're really about representing the school, and I don't think anyone wants to be represented by, He gestured vaguely at Daniel, someone who doesn't really fit the image. That made Daniel look up. "The competition is open to all students, Mr. Harrison said so." "Oh, sure, technically. But between you and me, some people just know when they're out of their depth. Saves everyone the embarrassment." Tyler pushed off from the doorframe and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there with anger burning in his chest. But he pushed it down, forced himself to breathe. Getting angry wouldn't help. Proving Tyler wrong would. The weekend passed slowly. Daniel practiced at home, giving his hands a bit of a break from the heavy action of the school piano. Mrs. Rodriguez made his favorite dinner on Sunday and asked how preparation was going. "Good," he told her. "I think I'm actually ready." "Of course you are," she said, smiling. "I knew you would be." Monday morning, Daniel arrived at school early as usual. Robert, the security guard, waved him through and he made his way to the music wing. He was eager to get to practice, to work on a tricky transition that had been giving him trouble. He unlocked practice room 7, flipped on the lights and froze. The piano was different. It looked similar at first glance. Same general size and color, but this wasn't the piano he'd been practicing on. This one was older, more battered. He moved closer, examining it with growing dread. Someone had switched the pianos. Between Friday afternoon and Monday morning, someone had taken out the old but functional piano and replaced it with something else entirely. Daniel sat down and pressed a key. The sound was muffled, dead. He tried another. The action was so stiff he had to push hard just to get the key to go down. He played a simple C major scale, and what came out sounded like a piano that was dying, weak and uneven. His heart pounded. He ran through a section of the Rachmaninoff, and it was a disaster. The dynamic control he'd been developing was impossible with this instrument. The soft, delicate passages required so much pressure that they came out harsh. The powerful sections sounded muddy because the strings weren't resonating properly. This wasn't just an old piano. This was a broken piano. Daniel stood up, panic rising in his throat. He had 3 weeks until the competition. 3 weeks to perform a piece that required absolute precision and emotional nuance. And someone had just taken away his practice instrument and replaced it with something essentially unplayable. He rushed to the music office, but it was still too early. No one would be there for another hour. He went back to room 7 and tried practicing again, hoping maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't as bad as he thought. It was worse. Every section he'd perfected on the previous piano fell apart on this one. His fingers had to work twice as hard to produce half the sound. The timing was all wrong because the keys didn't respond consistently. Some required heavy pressure, others barely any, with no pattern he could predict. When the music office finally opened, Daniel was there immediately. The secretary looked up, startled. "The piano in room 7 has been changed," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's not the same one I've been practicing on, and this new one is broken. The keys don't work properly." She frowned and checked her computer. "I don't have any record of pianos being moved." "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm completely sure. Someone switched them over the weekend." "Well, I'll make a note for the maintenance department to check on it. But the piano tuner isn't scheduled to come back until next week, and all our practice rooms are currently assigned. I'm sorry, but you'll have to make do with what you have." Make do with a piano that barely worked. 3 weeks before the biggest performance of his life, Daniel walked out of the office feeling numb. In the hallway, he saw Tyler and his friends by the lockers. They were talking and laughing, not even looking his direction. But Tyler's timing, showing up at his practice room Friday, making those comments about people knowing when they're out of their depth, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a scheduling mistake or bureaucratic confusion. This was deliberate. They'd sabotaged his piano because they wanted him to fail. They wanted to humiliate him publicly, to prove he never belonged at Riverside Academy in the first place. The scholarship kid with big dreams, crashing and burning on stage in front of everyone. Daniel made it to the bathroom before the tears came. He locked himself in a stall and let them fall, silent and hot. Tears of frustration and anger and helplessness. He'd worked so hard. He'd gotten up at dawn every day, practiced until his fingers bled, learned an impossible piece with nothing but YouTube videos and determination, and they'd broken his piano. After a few minutes, he wiped his face and took a deep breath. He had a choice to make. He could give up, withdraw from the competition, prove them right. Or he could figure out a way to fight back. But how do you fight when they control everything? The practice rooms, the instruments, even the staff who were too afraid to challenge families that donated millions to the school? Daniel looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Red eyes, worn-out jacket, face that showed every one of his 15 hard years. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was fooling himself, thinking he could compete in their world. But then he thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, waiting up for him every night when he came home from practice. About Robert the security guard, letting him in early every morning without question. About Mr. Harrison, who'd at least tried to help even if his hands were tied. And he thought about the music itself. The Rachmaninoff concerto that started in darkness but fought its way to light. That piece wasn't written for people who'd had everything handed to them. It was written by someone who understood struggle, who knew what it meant to push through impossible circumstances. Daniel straightened his shoulders and left the bathroom. He had 3 weeks and a broken piano. If they wanted to play it this way, fine. He'd show them what someone with nothing to lose could accomplish. The next morning, Daniel arrived at practice room 7 with a different mindset. If they wanted to break him with a broken piano, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. He spent the first hour just testing the instrument, pressing each key repeatedly, feeling how much pressure it required, listening to the quality of sound it produced. The results were worse than he'd thought. The piano wasn't just old, it was damaged in ways that seemed almost calculated. The middle C was the worst, requiring twice the pressure of the keys around it and producing a sound that was more thud than tone. The high notes were tinny and weak. The low notes had lost their resonance, sounding hollow and dead. But Daniel noticed something else. The problems weren't random. Someone had known exactly which piano to choose. One that would seem functional at first glance but would make actual performance impossible. This wasn't neglect or bad luck. This was targeted sabotage. He pulled out his phone and started making notes. Each key's quirks, its pressure requirement, its tonal quality. If he couldn't get a different piano, he'd have to adapt to this one, learn its broken language and find a way to communicate through it anyway. The morning practice session was brutal. Every section of the Rachmaninoff that he'd refined over the past month fell apart on this instrument. The delicate opening, which required feather-light touches and precise control, came out clumsy and harsh. The powerful crescendos, which should have been thunderous and moving, sounded muddy and unclear. During lunch, Daniel sat alone in the cafeteria, reviewing his notes from practice. Around him, other students laughed and talked, complaining about homework and making plans for the weekend. Normal teenage problems. He couldn't remember the last time his biggest worry had been something that simple. "Mind if I sit here?" Daniel looked up to find a girl standing by his table, lunch tray in hand. Her name was Ashley, he knew from music class. She was quiet, kept to herself mostly, played violin in the school orchestra. Not part of Tyler's crowd, but not exactly friendly with Daniel either. Just another face in the sea of privilege. "It's a free country," Daniel said, turning back to his notes. She sat down anyway, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. Then she spoke quietly. "I heard about your piano." Daniel's hand tightened on his pencil. "What about it?" "I practice in room 6 right next door. I heard you Friday, and I heard you this morning." It's definitely not the same instrument. He didn't know what to say to that. Was she going to gloat? Offer fake sympathy? "Tyler's been bragging about it," she continued, even quieter now. "At a party this weekend. He and his friends think it's hilarious. They bribed some maintenance guys to switch out your piano with one from storage that was about to be thrown away." The pencil snapped in Daniel's hand. Hearing his suspicions confirmed made it real in a way it hadn't been before. They'd actually done it. They deliberately sabotaged him, and they were proud of it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Ashley looked uncomfortable. "Because it's not right. I know I'm not going to speak up or anything. I can't afford to. My family isn't like Tyler's. We're just regular people who worked really hard to afford tuition here." "If I make waves," she trailed off. "But you should know what happened. And you should know that some of us think it's terrible what they're doing." She stood up with her tray, paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I heard your audition tape. You're really good. Way better than Tyler, actually, even if he has spent a fortune on lessons." Then she walked away before Daniel could respond. He sat there for a long moment, processing. So it was confirmed. Tyler had arranged this. Tyler, whose family name was on the library and the science building. Tyler, who'd never had to work for anything in his entire life and couldn't stand the thought of losing to someone like Daniel. The anger that Daniel had been trying to suppress came roaring back. It wasn't fair. Nothing about this was fair. He'd followed all the rules, earned his scholarship legitimately, worked harder than anyone else here, and they'd rigged the game against him anyway. That afternoon, Daniel went back to the music office and asked again about getting a different practice room. The secretary was less sympathetic this time. "Mr. Harrison made the room assignments and they're final. If you have concerns about your piano, you can submit a formal maintenance request, but as I told you, the tuner won't be available until after the competition." "But this piano is broken." "Actually broken. I can't prepare properly on it." She gave him a tight smile. "I'm sure you're exaggerating. These are all quality instruments. Perhaps you simply need to adjust your technique." Adjust your technique, like the problem was him, not the deliberately sabotaged piano. Daniel walked out before he said something he'd regret. In the hallway, he nearly ran into Mr. Harrison. "Daniel, how's the preparation going?" Everything came spilling out. The switched piano, the broken keys, the office's refusal to help. Mr. Harrison's face grew concerned as he listened. "That's very troubling. Let me come down and hear this piano myself." They went to practice room 7 together, and Daniel demonstrated the problems. Mr. Harrison played a few notes himself, frowning. "You're right, this instrument is in poor condition. I don't understand how it ended up in a practice room." He pulled out his phone and took photos. "I'll speak with the facilities manager immediately. This isn't acceptable." Relief flooded through Daniel. Finally, someone was listening. Someone who could actually do something about it. But that relief was short-lived. The next day, Mr. Harrison pulled Daniel aside after class, looking uncomfortable. "I spoke with facilities about your piano. According to their records, that's the same piano that's been in room 7 all year. They have no record of any piano being moved. But that's impossible. I've been practicing on a different piano for a month. Someone switched them. Mr. Harrison held up a hand. I believe you, but without any documentation of a switch, and with the maintenance staff denying it happened, there's not much I can do. I pushed for you to be reassigned to a different practice room, but the headmaster felt that would be unfair to other students who are also working with their assigned spaces. Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. So I'm just supposed to compete on a broken piano? I'm sorry, Daniel. I really am. I wish I could do more, but my hands are tied here. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There are certain families at this school who have considerable influence. If I pushed too hard on this, I could lose my job and then I wouldn't be able to help any students. He didn't say Tyler's name. He didn't have to. Mr. Harrison put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You're a talented pianist. Much more talented than your situation would suggest. If you can find a way to work with what you have, I think you could still surprise people at the competition. After he left, Daniel sat in the empty practice room and stared at the broken piano. This was it. This was really happening. They'd sabotaged him, and they were going to get away with it. The system was rigged, the game was fixed, and he was the only one playing by the rules. For the first time since receiving his acceptance letter, Daniel seriously considered quitting. Just withdrawing from the competition, maybe even leaving Riverside Academy altogether. Go back to public school where at least people were honest about not caring, where nobody pretended the system was fair. That evening, he told Mrs. Rodriguez everything. She listened quietly, her expression growing more and more angry as the story unfolded. Those spoiled little... She caught herself, took a breath. Daniel, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Maybe I should just quit. What's the point of trying when they can just cheat and everyone looks the other way? Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Come with me. She led him to her bedroom and pulled out an old photo album from her closet. She flipped through until she found what she was looking for, a picture of a young woman in a cap and gown. That's me. College graduation. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. You know how I paid for it? Daniel shook his head. I worked 3 jobs. Cleaned offices at night, waited tables on weekends, worked at the library between classes. I was exhausted all the time. And I watched classmates whose parents paid for everything party every night while I was scrubbing toilets. She turned the page to another photo, her receiving some kind of award. This is me getting the Outstanding Student Achievement Award my senior year. The dean who handed it to me had told me freshman year that I should probably drop out, that people like me weren't cut out for university. He thought I was too old, too poor, too behind. He suggested I consider a community college instead. She closed the album and looked at Daniel. I could have quit so many times. It would have been easier. Nobody would have blamed me. But you know what kept me going? Every time someone told me I couldn't do it, every time the system tried to push me out, it just made me more determined to prove them wrong. But they sabotaged my piano. Mrs. Rodriguez, how am I supposed to compete against that? You adapt. You overcome. You find a way. She gripped his shoulders. Daniel, life isn't fair. The system isn't fair. Rich kids are always going to have advantages. But you know what they don't have? They don't have what you have. They don't have your hunger, your determination, your ability to survive things that would break them. They gave you a broken piano? Fine. Learn to play a broken piano better than they play their perfect ones. Daniel wanted to believe her, but doubt still gnawed at him. What if I can't? What if I practice on that broken piano for 3 weeks and then bomb the performance? Then Tyler wins anyway and everyone will say I never belonged there in the first place. Then at least you tried. At least you didn't let them break you without a fight. She squeezed his shoulders. But I don't think you're going to bomb. I think you're going to surprise everyone, including yourself. Because you're not just playing against Tyler and his perfect piano. You're playing for every kid who's been told they're not good enough. Who's had doors slammed in their face, who's been underestimated their whole life. That night, Daniel lay in bed thinking about everything Mrs. Rodriguez had said. About adaptation and determination. About not letting them break you. He thought about the maintenance workers who'd accepted bribes to switch his piano. About the secretary who'd dismissed his concerns. About Mr. Harrison who believed him but was too afraid to really help. About the system that protected people like Tyler while throwing obstacles at people like him. And he thought about Ashley's words at lunch. You're really good. Way better than Tyler. Maybe she was right. Maybe even with all his advantages, Tyler wasn't actually the better pianist. He'd just had every opportunity handed to him while Daniel had to fight for scraps. But fighting for scraps had made Daniel tough. It had made him appreciate every small victory. It had taught him to work harder than everyone else just to stay in the game. By morning, Daniel had made his decision. He wasn't going to quit. He wasn't going to give Tyler the satisfaction. If they wanted to play dirty, fine, but he wasn't going to make it easy for them. He went to practice room 7 with new purpose. If this broken piano was all he had, then he'd master this broken piano. He'd learn every quirk, every problem, every inconsistency. He'd practice until his fingers knew exactly how much pressure each key needed. He'd adapt his technique, adjust his interpretation, find a way to make music even through this instrument's limitations. It was slow, frustrating work. Hours of repetition, training his muscles to accommodate the piano's problems. The delicate passages had to be played with more force than they should need. The powerful sections had to be carefully controlled because the piano couldn't handle too much energy. He had to rethink his entire approach to the piece. But gradually, something started to happen. His fingers got stronger from having to work so much harder. His control improved because he had to be more precise. His understanding of the music deepened because he couldn't rely on the instrument to do the work for him. 1 week before the competition, during his early morning practice, Daniel played through the entire concerto without stopping. It wasn't perfect. The piano still sounded broken in places, and some sections still didn't work the way they should. But he made it through, and there were moments, brief flashes, where the music actually came alive despite everything. Robert, the security guard, who'd been passing by, stopped outside the practice room and listened. When Daniel finished, Robert opened the door and gave him a thumbs up. "That was beautiful, son. Real beautiful." It was a small moment, barely worth mentioning, but in that moment, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He'd been so focused on what was wrong, on what had been taken from him, that he'd forgotten why he'd started playing piano in the first place. Not to compete, not to win prizes, but because music gave him a voice when nothing else could. Because when he played, he could express things he had no words for. All the pain and hope and anger and dreams, all of it could flow through his fingers into sound. Tyler and his friends could sabotage his piano. They could rig the system against him, but they couldn't take away his ability to feel the music, to understand it on a level that no amount of expensive lessons could teach. The final week of practice was intense. Daniel lived and breathed the Rachmaninoff. He practiced on the broken piano at school, then came home and practiced more on Mrs. Rodriguez's old upright, then fell into bed exhausted only to dream about chord progressions and finger positions. 3 days before the competition, Tyler appeared at his practice room again. Daniel had been expecting this. Tyler couldn't resist gloating. "Still at it, huh? That's really admirable, actually. Most people would have given up by now." Daniel kept playing, not looking up. "I heard your piano's been giving you trouble. That's rough. Really unfortunate timing." Tyler's voice was dripping with fake sympathy. Daniel's fingers hit a wrong note. He stopped playing and finally looked at Tyler. "You're not going to get to me," he said quietly. "Whatever you think you've accomplished with your little prank, it's not going to work." Tyler's smirk widened. "Prank? I don't know what you're talking about. I've just been practicing on my assigned piano, preparing for the competition. Speaking of which, have you heard the performance order yet? Your last, the grand finale. No pressure, right?"
Especially following my Chopin.
After Tyler left, Daniel's hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from suppressed anger. Last in the order meant following 11 other performers, including Tyler's perfectly polished performance. It meant the judges would be tired, their standards high after hearing so much music. It meant one more challenge stacked on top of all the others, but it also meant he'd have the last word. The final impression. If he could pull this off, if he could actually deliver a performance that moved people despite everything, that would be what the judges remembered. That night, Mrs. Rodriguez found him at the piano at midnight, still practicing. "Daniel, you need to sleep. You've practiced enough. I need to be perfect. I can't mess this up." She sat down beside him. "Nobody's perfect. And you know what? That's okay. That's what makes music beautiful. Not perfection, but honesty, feeling, connection." She was right. He knew she was right. But the fear was still there, coiled tight in his chest. Fear that he'd embarrass himself, that he'd prove Tyler right. that all his work would amount to nothing. "What if I fail?" he whispered. "Then you fail. And you get up and try again." She put her arm around his shoulders. "But Daniel, you've already won in ways that matter more than any competition. You didn't let them break you. You didn't give up. You fought back with the only weapon you had, your music and your determination. That's the real victory." 2 days before the competition, Daniel woke up with a thought that made his heart race. He'd been practicing on the broken piano for 3 weeks, adapting to its problems, building strength and control to compensate for its limitations. But the competition piano wouldn't be broken. It would be a beautiful, well-maintained concert grand. His fingers, trained on an instrument that required twice the effort, would suddenly have a piano that responded to the lightest touch. He couldn't decide if that was terrifying or exciting. Maybe both. One day before the competition, Mr. Harrison gave all the competitors a chance to try the performance piano. Daniel's slot was late afternoon. He walked into the concert hall and his breath caught. The piano on stage was magnificent. A Steinway grand, black and gleaming under the stage lights. Daniel sat down at the bench, positioned his hands, and played a simple scale. The difference was shocking. The keys responded instantly, perfectly. The sound rich and full and exactly what he'd imagined in his head. After weeks of fighting the broken piano, this felt like flying. He played through a section of the Rachmaninoff, and it was like hearing the piece for the first time. Every nuance he'd been trying to achieve was suddenly possible. The delicate touches actually sounded delicate. The powerful moments had real impact. His fingers, strengthened by weeks of extra effort, moved across the keys with a speed and precision he hadn't known he was capable of. When he finished, Mr. Harrison was standing at the back of the hall, smiling. "That sounded wonderful, Daniel. Really wonderful." That night, Daniel barely slept. Tomorrow was the competition. Tomorrow he'd either vindicate all his hard work or confirm everyone's doubts. Tomorrow he'd find out if Mrs. Rodriguez was right, if the struggle really did make him stronger. And tomorrow, Tyler Whitmore would learn that there were some things money couldn't buy. The morning of the competition arrived gray and cold. Daniel woke up at 5 out of habit, even though his performance wasn't until that evening. His hands felt stiff, and his stomach was doing nervous flips. Mrs. Rodriguez had already left a note on the kitchen table with a thermos of hot tea and a bagel, along with a simple message. "Believe in yourself." "I already do." He tried to eat but couldn't manage more than a few bites. Instead, he sat at her old piano and played through some warm-up exercises. Nothing too demanding. He needed to conserve his energy, keep his hands loose and ready, but playing helped calm his nerves, gave him something to focus on besides the mounting anxiety. By afternoon, he started getting ready. Mrs. Rodriguez had taken him shopping the week before, insisting on buying him a proper concert outfit. Nothing fancy, they couldn't afford that, but a decent black shirt and pants that actually fit. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. He looked older somehow, more serious. "You look very handsome," Mrs. Rodriguez said from the doorway. Her eyes were a little watery. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel. No matter what happens tonight." They arrived at Riverside Academy an hour early. The parking lot was already filling up with expensive cars. Parents in designer clothes walked toward the concert hall, chatting and laughing like this was just another social event. For them, maybe it was. For Daniel, it was everything. Backstage was chaos. 12 nervous students, some pacing, others doing last-minute practice on the warm-up piano in the corner. Parents fussed over their children, adjusting ties and dresses. Private instructors gave final words of advice to their students. Daniel stood alone in the corner watching. No private instructor for him. No parents to fuss over his appearance. Just him and his music and the weight of everything he'd overcome to get here. Tyler arrived with his usual entourage. His father, a tall man in an expensive suit who looked like he owned the world. His mother, dripping in jewelry. His private instructor, the conservatory professor, speaking to him in low, encouraging tones. Tyler himself looked confident, relaxed, like he'd already won. When Tyler spotted Daniel, he made his way over, that familiar smirk on his face. "Big night, scholarship boy. Nervous?" Daniel met his eyes. "Should I be?" "Well, performing last is tough, especially when you're following me." Tyler's smile widened. "But hey, at least you'll get to hear how it's supposed to sound before you go out there." Something in Daniel snapped. All the weeks of sabotage, the broken piano, the casual cruelty, He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Tyler could hear. "I know what you did. The piano switch. The bribes. All of it." For just a second, Tyler's confident mask slipped. Then he recovered, shrugging. "I don't know what you're talking about. But even if someone did switch your piano, so what? You going to run crying to the administration? Good luck with that. My family built half this school. I'm not going to the administration," Daniel said quietly. "I'm going to beat you on stage. In front of everyone." Tyler laughed, but it sounded forced. "With 3 weeks of practice on a broken piano? Yeah, good luck with that." He walked away, but Daniel noticed he didn't look quite as confident as before. Mr. Harrison gathered all the performers for a final briefing. He explained the order, the stage procedures, the timing. Daniel would perform last, number 12. He'd have to sit through 11 performances before his turn came. "Remember," Mr. Harrison said, "this isn't about competition. It's about sharing music, about expressing yourself through your art. Whatever happens tonight, you've all worked hard and you should be proud." Easy for him to say. For most of these students, tonight was just another recital, another line on their already impressive resumes. For Daniel, it was a chance to prove that he deserved to be here, that talent and determination mattered more than money and connections. The concert hall was packed. Daniel peeked through the curtain and saw hundreds of people in the audience. Families, teachers, students, local music critics who came to these events. His stomach clenched. He'd never played for this many people before. The lights dimmed, and the competition began. The first performer was a girl named Katie, who played Mozart with technical precision but little emotion. She was good, very good, but the performance felt rehearsed, mechanical. Polite applause followed. The second performer was better, a boy who played Debussy with real feeling. The audience responded warmly. Daniel felt his anxiety ratchet up another notch. These were all talented musicians. He wasn't competing against amateurs. Performer after performer took the stage. Some were brilliant, some were merely good. Each one made Daniel more nervous. By the time the 8th performer finished, his hands were sweating and his heart was racing. He tried to focus on breathing, on staying calm, but the pressure was building. Tyler was number 9. He walked onto the stage with easy confidence, waving to people he knew in the audience. He sat at the Steinway, took a moment to settle himself, and began playing Chopin's Ballade number 1. Daniel had to admit, Tyler was good. Really good. His technique was flawless, every note precisely placed. His interpretation was sophisticated, clearly the result of extensive coaching. The audience was captivated. This was what money and privilege could buy. Polish, refinement, perfection. When Tyler finished, the applause was enthusiastic and long. He stood and bowed, soaking it in. As he walked off stage, he passed Daniel in the wings and whispered, "Follow that." Daniel's confidence, already shaky, took a hit. Tyler's performance had been exactly what the judges were looking for. Technically perfect, musically mature, professionally presented. How was Daniel supposed to compete with that? 2 more performers went. Both were good, but neither matched Tyler's performance. By the time number 11 finished, it was clear that Tyler had delivered the standout performance of the evening. The judges were writing notes, nodding to each other. Tyler's victory seemed certain. Then Mr. Harrison announced the final performer. And last, but certainly not least, we have Daniel Rodriguez performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Daniel walked onto the stage on shaky legs. The lights were blinding.